Welcome to Chapter 13, The Influence of Modern Art. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were a time of incredible growth that forever changed the social, political, cultural, and economic aspects of human life. War transformed the face of the earth. Basic ideas about color, form, social protest, and raw emotion occupied the thoughts of many artists. Some modern movements had more of an effect than others on graphic design as a whole, such as Cubism, Futurism, Dada, and Surrealism, which we will be discussing in this chapter. Let's start with Cubism. Pablo Picasso is the father of Cubism, and Cubism introduced a design concept which was not based on nature. This began a new artistic tradition and way of looking at things that challenged 400 years of Renaissance pictorial art. Pablo Picasso was the father of this movement and began with a series of work that applied elements of ancient Iberian and African art to the human figure. African sculpture, masks, and fabrics were exciting sources of inspiration for Pablo and his friends. You need to consider what are the general characteristics of Cubism. Cubism had 2 phases. The first is analytical. Picasso and his friend Georges Braque evolved Cubism as the modern art movement that replaced rendering appearances as lifelike with endless possibilities of invented form. The shapes, textures, and values are the real subjects of these early paintings. The Cubists sought to show everyday objects as the mind, not the eye, perceives them from all sides at once. What are some of the other characteristics of analytical Cubism? The next phase of Cubism is synthetic Cubism, and this evolved around 1913. Juan Gris developed synthetic Cubism. His work had an influence on the development of geometric art and design. So you need to tell me and be able to discuss what are the characteristics of synthetic Cubism. Now let's move on to Futurism. Futurism began when Italian poet Filippo Marinetti published the Manifesto of Futurism in a Paris newspaper in February 1909. His work challenged all areas of art to test their ideas and forms against the new realities of science and industry. Futurism became a revolutionary movement. This manifesto, which was published in the newspaper, voiced enthusiasm for war, the machine age, speed, and modern life. Quote, "We will destroy museums, libraries, and fight against moralism, feminism, and all utilitarian cowardice," end quote. Marinetti and his followers created emotionally charged poetry that defied correct syntax and grammar. Harmony was rejected and replaced with several ink colors, type styles, overemphasize words or word meaning. A new artistic style was born, which was called Words in Freedom. So looking at all these slides, I want you to tell me what are 2 common elements in futuristic poetry. Now, most of these modern art movements began as a literary movement. Other examples of futuristic poetry include Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures in Wonderland. And here's another example from Stephen Mallarmé, which was a poem that had several hundred words spaced over 20 pages. It used capital, lowercase, Roman, and italic fonts. He placed his words in unexpected places on the page to express sensations and evoke ideas. Marinetti's rival was Julian Apollinaire. He was associated with the Cubists. He incorporated words, letters, and phrases into complex visual collages. His main contribution was a book called Calligrams. It contains poems in which the letter forms were arranged to form a visual design, figure, or pictograph. In this particular picture here, called It's Raining, from Calligrams, letter forms sprinkle figuratively down the page, relating visual form to poetic content. In February 1910, several artists got together and published the Manifesto of the Futurist Painters. Giacomo Balla was one of those artists. This manifesto stated that this movement wanted to destroy the cult of the past and validate all kinds of imitation and elevate all attempts at originality. It wanted to regard art critics as useless and dangerous and sweep the whole field of art clean of all themes and subjects which had been used in the past. It wanted to glorify a world that is splendidly transformed by victorious science. These artists were strongly influenced by Cubism, but they also tried to express movement, energy, and cinematic sequences in their paintings. Fortunato Depero was one of the first designers to apply futuristic principles to graphic design. In 1927, he published Dynamo Azarii, which was a compilation of his typographical experiments, his ads, and other works. This book is important because it was the precursor to the artist book, which is published by the artist as a creative expression independent of the publisher. Today, you may know it as a portfolio. He worked for a time in New York, and his audience was limited to a cosmopolitan crowd. However, the appearance of his futurist work in the American graphic communication proved influential in our movement towards modernism. How did Futurism affect other art movements? And what was Fortunato Depero's contribution to the modern art movement? Let's talk about our next modern art movement called Dada. Dada claimed to be anti-art and had a strong negative and destructive element. Dada artists and poets were concerned with the shock value of their work, protest, and nonsense. They rebelled against the world in all of its war, decadence, faith in technology, religion, and conventional moral codes. The Dada movement sprang into existence as a literary movement after Hugo Ball opened the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, Switzerland. This was a gathering place of independent young poets, painters, and musicians. In this poem, which is a sound and sight poem, this expresses the Dadaist desire to replace man's logical nonsense with illogical nonsense. So this poem, for all practical purposes, basically says something like, kitty, bang bang, I like eggs, kaboom. That's kind of the kind of nonsense we're talking about. Now, they did apply some of these Dada elements to this book cover, which is called The Bearded Heart, where you have this random chance placement of this clip art here. And then you have French painter Marcel Duchamp, who joined the Dada movement and became its most recognized artist. Perhaps no work is more singularly identified with the transformation of art in the 20th century than this piece of art here called The Fountain by Duchamp. Dada quickly spread in Europe. Even though Dada's claim to be not creating art, but to be mocking and defaming a society gone mad, they did manage to create some notable visual art that influenced graphic design. Here, for example, is a photomontage done by Hannah Hoke. Dada's claim to have invented the photomontage, where images and materials are recycled. Here you can see there is both chance placement of elements and planned decisions aiding in the creative process. Now, Kurt Schwitters created a non-political offshoot of Dada called Merz. The phrase came from the word Kommerz, which means commerce, in one of his collages. Merz was a one-man art movement. You need to investigate and tell me what materials were his compositions created from. And then I'd also like you to know there's kind of a clue underneath the sentence here. How did Kurt Schwitters define poetry? Eventually, his work was influenced by the constructivists, which we'll talk about in chapter 15. He ran a successful design studio with Pelikan as a major client. He was also a topographer, and eventually the Nazis drove him from his home in Norway, where he fled to the British Isles. He was actually denied membership to the official Dada movement for being too bourgeois, which means social middle class or tending toward being mediocre. In contrast to Schwitters, German artist John Heartfield held strong political beliefs and used his artistic talents to raise the public consciousness and promote social change. His politically charged photomontages were banned in his home country during the Nazi regime. So he used photomontage as a powerful propaganda weapon, and let's look at some of the ways that he challenged the power of the Third Reich and Hitler through his visual images. In the first one, he's attacking the press in 1930. The caption reads, "Whoever reads the bourgeois press turns deaf and blind, away with these stupidity-causing bandages." And the second poster at Christmas time, under the headline, "O German Evergreen, how crooked are your branches," you have a pathetic tree symbolizing the pathos, which means the pity or the patheticness of the Third Reich. In the third poster in 1935, the headline, "Adolf the Superman swallows gold and talks tin," is visualized by a photomontage of Hitler showing an esophagus of gold coins. And in this last poster, 1932, is the meaning of the Hitler salute. It says, the real meaning of the Hitler salute, "The little man asks for big gifts." This is the cover of a magazine, AIZ 11. Heartfield's program of the Olympics from November of 1935 satirizes the Nazi regime by listing fictional Olympic events, such as axe swinging, head rolling, spear throwing, tug-of-war, fencing, writing the promissory note, body bending, and the grand finale, artillery fireworks. After his studio was occupied by Nazi forces in 1933, he fled to Prague, where he continued his Nazi propaganda and mailed postcard versions of his artwork to Nazi leaders. After finding out he was on a Nazi hit list, he fled to London, returning in 1950 to Germany. Before his death, he was able to produce photomontages protesting the Vietnam War. To conclude, Dada, its assault on all artistic and social tradition made it a major liberating movement that continues to inspire innovation and rebellion today. It was born in protest against war, but its destructive and exhibitionist activities became more and more ridiculous and extreme after the war ended.